This is also a time of change for my family.
King Charles had expected resistance. He had prepared for criticism. What he had never prepared for was the possibility that the most powerful advisors surrounding the crown would move against him in silence. Then, the sealed notice arrived. His emergency decree had been revoked by the Privy Council without the confrontation he believed was coming. One signature after another had stripped his decision of force, and suddenly, the monarch was staring at a devastating reality. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the first page again, slower this time, as if the words might change. They did not. The Privy Council had formally revoked his emergency crown decree, ruling that the extraordinary authority he tried to exercise could no longer take effect. The Privy Council, the body of senior advisors that formally counsels the sovereign on constitutional and governmental matters, had stopped him. The decree had been designed to centralize control over sensitive household appointments, restricted ceremonial access, and internal crown decisions during what he believed was a dangerous period of instability. Camilla saw the moment shock became something heavier. She watched Charles stop halfway through the briefing, lower himself into the chair, and place the notice on the table without finishing aloud. The Queen Consort understood this was not simply a technical defeat. He had trusted the people involved. He had expected resistance through argument or warning. Instead, the decision had been prepared without him. That silence cut deeper than the ruling, because it told the monarch that the machinery around the crown had already moved before he understood how isolated he had become. Charles turned to the consultation record, and the room seemed to tighten around one name. William had been heard before the vote. The prince had not engineered the revocation, but his constitutional concerns had been formally placed before the council, and that distinction offered little comfort. Charles stared at the entry, then looked toward Camilla. She did not defend William. She knew the king was no longer reading a constitutional record. He was reading what felt like evidence that his own son had known the ground beneath him was shifting. Charles closed the folder. An aide waited, but the monarch gave no instruction. He looked directly at him and asked only, "When did my son know?" Camilla remained completely and painfully silent. The decree had been destroyed on paper, but for Charles, the deeper wound was only beginning, because before he could challenge the council, he needed to discover exactly where William had been standing when the crown moved against its own king. Behind the constitutional language were three people trapped inside something painfully human. Charles saw authority slipping from his hands. William saw a monarchy approaching a dangerous boundary. And Camilla understood that whatever happened next could leave father and son carrying a wound no council meeting could repair. The revocation had lasted only moments on paper, yet inside the family it reopened years of tension over duty, judgment, inheritance, and who had the right to say no. Charles did not see the decree as a grab for permanent power. He believed it was an emergency safeguard, a temporary shield against competing palace factions that were pulling appointments, ceremonial access, and private decisions in different directions. The crown, meaning the sovereign and the institution built around that office, depended on continuity. To him, hesitation risked disorder. To William, however, the danger looked different. The prince understood that any extraordinary authority accepted now could become a precedent later, and one day he would inherit the consequences. Charles turned to Camilla and finally said what had been burning beneath his silence. Opposition from counselors would have hurt, he admitted, but William being consulted felt personal. The king believed his son had chosen constitutional caution over loyalty when loyalty mattered most. Camilla tried to steady him, yet she carried fears of her own. Several restrictions inside the decree had strengthened control around their household, and the Queen Consort knew that removing them could reopen rivalries she thought had finally been contained. William, meanwhile, had never demanded that the decree be revoked. During the consultation, he had asked one question: could emergency powers created to defend the monarchy actually weaken it if they bypassed the restraints that gave royal authority legitimacy? That question had stayed in the room long after he left. The future king had not called for rebellion. He had questioned the cost of obedience, with dangerous consequences ahead. Sophie learned something even more unsettling through a documented private briefing shared with senior family members. Anne had raised stronger objections weeks before William was approached. The trusted confidant understood immediately what that meant. Resistance inside the family had begun earlier and deeper than Charles realized. Sophie said little, but the knowledge changed how she saw the coming confrontation. William reached Charles's private room and stopped outside the door. He lifted his hand toward the handle, lowered it, then tried again. Inside, his father was already waiting, the revoked decree beside him. Yet the coming conversation could not be understood without returning to the moment that made the decree inevitable. Because one explosive royal confrontation had pushed Charles across a line the council would later force him to retreat from. The decree had not appeared from nowhere. Weeks earlier, one private confrontation had convinced Charles that ordinary palace rules were no longer enough. Voices had risen. A ceremonial decision had turned into an argument about authority. And before the evening ended, someone Charles trusted had challenged him in terms he could not forget. Those present would later recognize that night as the point of no return, the moment when frustration became fear, and fear became an emergency order capable of shaking the monarchy. Charles had been carrying months of frustration before that meeting began. Royal appointments were being questioned, access to private household discussions had become a source of tension, and ceremonial roles were increasingly becoming symbols of deeper disagreements over who could act independently during his reign. The sovereign's private household, the personal staff and advisors serving the monarch directly, was supposed to give him stability. Instead, he increasingly felt surrounded by competing loyalties. Anne had noticed the same strain, but she feared something different: proposals that would allow emergency authority to bypass normal consultation whenever circumstances were labeled exceptional. Charles finally reached his breaking point during a closed Windsor strategy meeting. Two senior household officials resisted one of his directives involving ceremonial planning, arguing that established consultation should come first. The king immediately ordered both officials removed from the planning process. Anne reacted without hesitation. She told her brother that emergency authority could never become a substitute for trust. The Princess Royal intended the warning as protection, but he heard something far more painful. To Charles, she was questioning whether he could still judge the people closest to his own crown. William tried to calm the exchange before it became irreversible. He urged both sides to separate the ceremonial dispute from the larger question of royal authority. But the prince would not immediately endorse his father's removal order. That hesitation changed everything. Charles looked from his sister to his son and felt something he had not expected to feel inside his own family: isolation. The future king believed he was preventing escalation. His father believed he was witnessing hesitation when loyalty should have been automatic. Charles acted before the anger could cool. Later that night, he privately instructed advisors to prepare the emergency crown decree, a temporary order designed to let him override certain internal procedures without following the usual sequence of consultation. Anne responded days later through a confidential written memorandum sent to the Privy Council, questioning whether such power could protect the monarchy without damaging its restraints. William never signed her memorandum, but he refused to condemn it when asked privately. Charles remained alone after the Windsor meeting had ended. He picked up the discarded briefing folder, stared at it for several seconds, and told his private secretary, "Prepare something that cannot be obstructed." Those words would return to haunt him. Now that very instrument had been overturned, and when Charles finally faced William, the argument was no longer about an old meeting. It was about whether a son had helped stop his father's authority. There were no advisors between them when Charles finally asked the question. No ceremonial language, no polished statement prepared by secretaries, only a father facing his eldest son across a quiet room, with the revoked decree lying between them like evidence of something broken. Charles wanted one answer: had William helped destroy his authority? But the response he received was more painful than a simple yes, and far more difficult for the king to dismiss. Charles had summoned William the moment he learned that his constitutional concerns had formed part of the council's deliberative record. The prince understood what that meant before he entered the room. A deliberative record, the formal account of arguments considered before a decision is reached, could preserve a person's words long after the emotion surrounding them had faded. William knew every answer now carried two meanings, one from an heir protecting the monarchy, and another from a son standing before a father who felt betrayed. Charles pushed the revoked decree across the table. He did not raise his voice. That made the question sharper. "Did you tell them to stop me?" William looked at the document, but did not touch it. The future king answered carefully. He had told them what he believed the crown could survive. The king stiffened. To him, the distinction sounded like betrayal, wrapped in constitutional language. His son refused to apologize for raising concerns, but he insisted he had never wanted his father humiliated. William finally told him what the record alone could not explain. The council had already gathered serious objections before anyone approached him. The prince said his opinion had not created the resistance. It had only confirmed that doubts existed inside the family, as well as among senior advisors. Charles listened without interrupting, but the anger remained. He had believed his son stood near the center of the revolt. Now he was being forced to consider something worse. The opposition had been larger than either of them understood. William then disclosed one detail from a documented private conversation that changed the room completely. Anne had personally urged counselors not to turn the dispute into a public confrontation. The Princess Royal opposed the decree, yet she had also tried to protect her brother from humiliation. Charles had imagined betrayal spreading through the family. Instead, the people challenging him had also been trying to contain the damage. Charles leaned back and looked away from his son. The question was no longer whether William had stood against him. Someone inside the Privy Council had coordinated the legal mechanism that neutralized his order, and the king now wanted that person identified. Father and son left the room wounded but standing, while attention shifted toward the chamber where the real blow had been prepared. The small circle of counselors, who had discovered how to defeat a king's command without attacking the crown itself. The most devastating challenge to Charles had not come from protesters, parliament, or a rival royal household. It had come from a room built around discretion. The Privy Council had no need for dramatic speeches. Its strength rested in precedent, procedure, and the terrifying ability to tell a sovereign that one of his own decisions had crossed a boundary. Yet behind the institutional language stood real people making a choice, and one counselor understood that confronting a king could end a career. Lord Harcourt sat alone before the decisive session, removed his glasses, and read the decree again from beginning to end. The Privy Council, the historic body of senior advisors who formally counsel the sovereign on certain constitutional and governmental matters, carried influence through law, convention, and restraint rather than raw personal power. Harcourt understood exactly why the document had caused alarm. Charles had placed broad internal royal authority under the label of emergency action, without limits clear enough to reassure those expected to defend the institution after the crisis passed. Harcourt remembered another room, months earlier, when Charles had thanked him personally for loyalty during a difficult household dispute. The memory made the coming decision harder. He was not voting against a stranger. He was preparing to recommend the cancellation of an order signed by a man who had trusted him. Yet the counselor also knew loyalty could become dangerous if it meant remaining silent when boundaries were being tested. For him, the choice had stopped being about obedience. It had become about whether protecting the monarch sometimes meant refusing him. The council's conclusion was narrower than Charles feared, but more devastating than he expected. Harcourt and the other counselors did not argue that the monarchy possessed no emergency authority at all. Their formal reasoning stated that this decree went too far because it lacked sufficient constitutional safeguards and no acceptable expiration mechanism had been established. That distinction mattered. They were not stripping the crown of power. They were declaring that this particular use of power had crossed a line. Harcourt knew the confrontation had almost been avoided. A confidential proposal had offered Charles a way out. Withdraw the decree voluntarily, replace it with a narrower order, and preserve his authority without forcing a formal rebuke. The king refused. He believed retreat would look like weakness, and that refusal triggered the revocation he had desperately wanted to avoid. Harcourt finally signed the recommendation. He paused with the pen still against the paper and said quietly, "This protects the crown, even if His Majesty never forgives us." Hours later, that sentence began acquiring consequences far beyond the council chamber. The council had won the constitutional battle, but victory came with a cost. Because the moment Charles's decree disappeared, every decision made under its authority began collapsing behind it. Revoking the decree did not simply erase a page. It pulled at every decision attached to it. Appointments were frozen. Restrictions were reconsidered. Staff who believed their positions had been settled suddenly received new instructions. Inside the palace, uncertainty moved faster than explanation. And for Charles, each reversal carried the same brutal message. The authority he had tried to strengthen had become the reason his control now looked more fragile than before. Charles listened as palace legal advisors began separating ordinary decisions from extraordinary measures that could no longer stand. The review mattered because every order issued under the decree now carried a question mark, and every question threatened another public sign of weakness. 2 household appointments were frozen, ceremonial restrictions were lifted pending review, and excluded advisors were restored to consultation. Consultation meant the normal process of seeking views before sensitive royal decisions were finalized, the safeguard the emergency order had bypassed. Charles made it halfway through the revised list before exhaustion overtook anger. He removed his reading glasses, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and told the secretary beside him to stop. Camilla watched him in silence before frustration surfaced. The queen consort knew one suspended change had tightened control around their shared household, limiting access for people feeding internal rivalries. Now those barriers were gone, and she feared old tensions would return, just as the king looked least able to contain them. Anne refused to treat the reversal as victory. When officials offered to restore one privilege immediately, the Princess Royal declined in a documented exchange, saying she would not appear to profit from her brother's defeat. That choice reached Charles before explanation did. He had expected resistance. He had not expected restraint from the very person whose objections had helped start the crisis. William made a similar choice. He instructed his staff not to celebrate the revocation and cancelled an internal briefing that could have looked like the heir was preparing to capitalize on his father's weakness. The prince understood that even the appearance of triumph could deepen the fracture. When Charles received the cancellation note, he read it twice. For the first time, the monarch considered that his son might have opposed the decree without wanting to diminish the man who signed it. Charles set the note beside the suspended orders and said nothing for several seconds. Camilla saw the change before he spoke. Anne's restraint and William's silence had created an opening no council could manufacture. The institutional battle had exhausted Charles, but it was Anne, not the council, who would finally force him to confront the question beneath every decree, vote, and argument. What had he been afraid of losing? When Anne entered, Charles had no folder waiting for her. No secretary remained in the room. No counselor could soften what needed to be said. For the first time since the crisis began, the king was not asking who had opposed him or which rule had been invoked. He was asking why his own sister believed stopping him had become necessary. Her answer did not defend the council. It reached somewhere much deeper, and Charles finally listened. Anne sat opposite her brother and refused to hide behind palace language. The Princess Royal told him plainly that she had never objected to him exercising authority. She objected to the way that authority had become more isolated whenever resistance appeared. The sovereign, meaning the monarch acting in his formal role as head of the crown, could command respect without demanding agreement. To her, the danger was not that Charles had made a difficult decision. It was that every disagreement had begun to look like disloyalty. Charles finally admitted what he had avoided saying aloud. The decree had been born partly from fear. He feared rival factions pulling his household apart, feared losing control over appointments and access, and feared that hesitation late in his reign would be read as weakness. The king told Anne he had felt pressure to prove that authority still meant something. She listened without interrupting, then answered with the kind of honesty only a sister could risk. Protecting the monarchy did not require him to win every argument. Anne leaned forward and told him that restraint was not surrender. Sometimes, she said, the crown was strongest when the person wearing it accepted limits rather than fighting them. She then revealed, through their private conversation, what Charles had never been told. She had personally urged counselors not to humiliate him in public, and had insisted the revocation remain confidential long enough for the family to absorb the shock. Her opposition had never been designed to destroy him. Charles looked at her differently when William's name surfaced. Anne explained that the prince had contacted her before the vote, not to coordinate resistance, but to ask whether the decree could be narrowed without publicly defeating his father. The future king had been searching for a compromise, while Charles believed he was choosing sides. Charles lowered his eyes for several seconds, then reached across the table and turned Anne's untouched cup toward her. "I thought you were trying to weaken me," he said. She answered quietly, "I was trying to keep you from weakening yourself." The king finally decided he would accept the revocation and speak to William again. But private reconciliation could not remain hidden forever, because by morning, the secret decision had escaped the palace, and Britain was about to see the king's humiliation transformed into a national argument about monarchy itself. By sunrise, the secret was no longer secret. The constitutional language that had devastated Charles behind palace doors now dominated broadcasts, front pages, and conversations across Britain. Some saw a monarch checked by necessary restraint. Others saw an institution turning against its own sovereign. Yet amid the noise, one image came to define the morning. Charles leaving for an official engagement, expression controlled, knowing millions were discussing whether the crown had just been protected or publicly diminished. Charles learned quickly that the palace could control statements, but not the meaning people attached to them. Buckingham Palace acknowledged that the decree was no longer in force after details reached political and royal correspondence. The official response emphasized constitutional procedure, the established rules and conventions that limit how royal authority is exercised, rather than defeat. Yet aides privately understood the problem. Once the story escaped, every headline could turn restraint into humiliation, and every discussion could turn constitutional caution into a family war. Camilla asked Charles whether attending his scheduled engagement was wise. The queen consort knew one hesitant appearance could become evidence of collapse, but disappearing could look even worse. He answered without anger. If he cancelled now, the king said, people would believe the decision had broken him. She studied him carefully, then stopped arguing. Charles had lost the decree. He was determined not to lose his composure with it. William faced a different kind of pain. The prince watched television coverage from Kensington Palace as commentators reduced months of constitutional tension to one dramatic conflict: father against son. He had never wanted that story. The future king had questioned the decree because he feared what unchecked emergency authority could mean for the monarchy. Yet now his caution was being recast as ambition. The public argument sharpened when a morning newspaper appeared beneath the stark headline, "Council blocks the king." Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered as some defended constitutional restraint, while others spoke openly of sympathy for Charles. Then a senior constitutional commentator, speaking during a live broadcast, offered a different interpretation. Perhaps the crisis proved the monarchy could correct itself without breaking apart. That single framing began shifting the national conversation from humiliation toward survival. Charles arrived at his engagement carrying all of it. Someone behind the barrier suddenly called, "Stay strong, Your Majesty." The monarch paused for the smallest moment before continuing, and that reaction became the most replayed image of the day. By evening, he knew symbolism was no longer enough. The public had watched a king endure defeat. Now Charles had one final choice: to treat restraint as humiliation, or transform the most painful challenge of his reign into proof that the crown could survive even the limits placed upon itself. Charles could have fought again. He could have demanded another legal interpretation, narrowed the decree, blamed advisors, or allowed resentment to harden into a lasting division with his son. Instead, after days of anger and humiliation, the king made the decision that finally ended the crisis. The emergency crown decree would not return. The council's revocation would stand. And in accepting the limit placed upon his own authority, Charles discovered that preserving the monarchy required something far harder than commanding obedience: knowing when to yield. Charles formally confirmed that he would not revive, replace, or challenge the decree. Ordinary consultation would return, meaning sensitive royal decisions would once again pass through the established process of advice and review rather than emergency authority. Household appointments were reconsidered separately, ceremonial restrictions were examined one by one, and the machinery that had produced the crisis began returning to normal. The king understood the cost. Accepting the decision meant surrendering the control he had fought to preserve, but fighting again could have damaged something far more valuable. Charles met William privately once more, and this time, no document divided them. The monarch acknowledged that disagreement was not the same as disloyalty. William admitted that he had underestimated how deeply the council's intervention would wound his father. Then the prince said what finally broke the emotional stalemate. He had never wanted to inherit a stronger crown by helping weaken the man currently wearing it. Charles listened without interrupting. For the first time, father and son were no longer defending positions. They were repairing trust. Charles also thanked Anne personally for protecting the confidentiality of the process, even while opposing him. The Princess Royal did not pretend their argument had disappeared, and neither did her brother. Yet he finally understood that her resistance had come from loyalty to the institution they had both inherited. Camilla reached the same difficult acceptance. The queen consort still disliked losing protections created around their household, but she recognized that rebuilding trust with William and Anne mattered more than preserving every advantage the decree had offered. Charles took the original decree from its folder one final time. He read the first paragraph, closed it, and handed it back to his secretary. "Archive it. It is finished." The words ended more than a constitutional dispute. The revocation had devastated him because it forced him to confront the limits of kingship inside his own family. Yet refusing retaliation restored what the decree had endangered: trust, restraint, and judgment. And that became the final meaning of the crisis. Charles lost his emergency decree, but by accepting that loss, he prevented a constitutional defeat from becoming a family rupture, and proved that the crown could emerge stronger precisely because even a king could be told no. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.